Hello everyone, welcome you all back, and in this video we are going to understand synchronized method. Okay, so we have a class called synchronized method, and inside that we have a method called display, which is a synchronized method. So using the synchronized keyword you can define a method as synchronized. Okay, and we'll try to access this synchronized method using multiple threads and try to understand the properties of synchronized method. So one of the properties is whenever a thread tries to access this method using any object, then that object needs to be locked first. Then only it can access the instruction inside that method. And once it is done executing the instruction, once it comes out of the method, it will release the lock. Okay, so let's see what we are doing in the main method is we have created an object of this class, and we have a thread where we are writing the run method and doing some instruction, and what we are doing is calling the display method using this object. Okay, we have one more thread called t2 and we are doing the same thing from t2 as well. Okay, after that what we are doing t1.start and t2.start. Any of the thread can start based on the scheduler, but most probably t1 will start first because we are starting t1 first. Okay, so the moment we do t1.start, it goes into the t1 thread, and then it sees what it needs to do inside the run method. It executes this line, okay, and then it says using object1 I need to call display method. Okay, so goes to the display method and understand this is a synchronized method, so I need to acquire the lock. So the thread t1 acquires the lock on this object, okay, and it do some kind of print over here, and then it sleeps for some time, and then again it performs some operation. And once this is done, after completing the method, it will release the lock. But meanwhile, there is another thread which is trying to access this synchronized method. If you see T2, okay, but T2 cannot execute anything inside this method until the lock is released. Okay, so T2 will wait for T1 to complete this synchronized method, and then once the lock is released from T1, T2 will acquire the lock and T2 will perform these operations. Okay, and if you see in the both the threads T1 and T2, we are using the same object, object1. Okay, so since the lock is here on object1 and T2 is also trying to use the object1 lock, that's the reason they cannot execute simultaneously. They need to wait for one thread to complete and then T2 will execute. Okay, so let's execute this program and see. Let me run the program. Okay, so let both the thread complete their task and then we'll understand what it is doing. Okay, so if you see, thread 0 is started first. Okay, then thread 0 goes to that method and acquires the log to this object of this class. Then it starts sleeping. While it was sleeping, T1 is also started, and here T1 is also trying to acquire the lock. Okay, but it is not able to acquire the lock because T0 has already acquired the lock and it is sleeping. That after that sleep is completed, T0 wakes up and performs some operations on the same object, and when all the operations are performed in that method, it will release the lock. Once it has released the lock after this line, T1 has acquired the lock. If you see this line on the same object, these are the same objects, and then after performing a certain operation, it starts sleeping. And once it is done sleeping, it come off out of the sleep, it performs some operation, and then again it releases the lock. So this is how synchronized method works. So let's understand what is the need of synchronized method. Let's say there are two threads and both are accessing the same method, and inside that method we are doing some read or write, so or updating a variable. So thread 1 is updating the variable, and thread 2 needs to take that updated variable and use it. Okay, but if it is not a synchronized method, what will happen? Before thread 1 has completed updating the variable, thread 2 comes and picks that variable value and use it. So this is inconsistency. So in order to avoid this, we have a synchronized method, so that one thread completes, then only other threads can come and use those details. Hope this is clear to you. So you might get this question, that if there are multiple objects, then how this synchronized method works. Okay, so let's see that in action, and let me create one more object. Let's call it object 2. Let's create a few threads. Copy and paste. Let's call it T3, and here we'll do object 2 dot display. Okay, let's create one more thread, which we'll call T4. So as of now, we are having 4 threads. Okay, T1 and T2 are using object 1, and T3 and T4 are using object 2. Okay, now as I mentioned, synchronized method will acquire lock on the object. Okay, in order to understand this, we need to start both the thread T3 dot start and T4 dot start. Okay, now what will happen? T1 will start. Okay, it will do certain, it will lock the object and try to access this method. It will do this operation and unlock the object, and simultaneously T3 or T4, any one of these, can also access this method. Why it is possible here? Because if you see, T1 and T2 are using object 1. Okay, so the lock will applied on object 1, and T3 and T4 are using a different object 2. So the lock will be applied on object 2. So let's save this and run this and see. Let this complete the operation, and we'll try to understand what is happening. Okay, so thread 0 is started. Thread 0 has acquired the lock and is sleeping. Meanwhile, T1 and T2 is also started. So if you see, T1 is still sleeping, T0 is still sleeping, and T2 has also acquired the lock, but it is on different object. If you see, this is a different object, this is a different object, and they have T2 has acquired the lock on this object, and T0 has acquired the lock on the other object at the same time. So this I'm trying to show you, that if you're trying to access the synchronized method using different object, then they can be performed simultaneously. Hope this is clear to you. Okay guys, so there's one more thing which comes to our mind. If two different threads are using the same object, and they both the objects are trying to access, I mean, one of the object is trying to access the synchronized method and another is trying to access the unsynchronized method, okay, simultaneously, then what will happen, whether this is possible or not? So the answer of this question is yes, it is possible, and I'll show that in you in action. So what I'll do, I'll create a method, I'll call it as check. I'll print something over here. We can print thread dot current thread dot get id, and what else we can say, that this is a not non-synchronized block or method. This is not synchronized method. Okay, now what we can do is we can remove this object. We'll use only one object. We can remove these two thread as well. Remove this as well. Now we have one object Okay, we have a thread called T1 from which we are calling a synchronized method. We have one more thread T2. From here, what we'll do, we'll call the check method, which is not synchronized. And what we'll do here, we'll make this thread to sleep so that it is started. It will execute only after the thread one acquires the lock. So we'll make it sleep for a few milliseconds. And since it throws an exception, we need to do a try catch. Okay, let's remove this. So let's understand what will happen. T1 will start. Okay, it will go inside this thread. It will execute this line, and then it will try to access this method. And since there are no lock as of now, so it will acquire the lock and it will perform this operation. Okay, and meanwhile it will sleep for some time. So meanwhile it is sleeping. The thread 2 tries to access the check method over here, right, which is not synchronized. So the question here is, since the lock is applied, will this method be executed only after the lock is released, or it can be executed before the lock is released? So it can be executed before the lock is released because the lock is applied to the object and it is only applicable for the synchronized methods. Okay, so let's run this program and see. Okay, so you see thread 0 is started, thread 0 has acquired the lock, and thread 0 is sleeping, right? So at this time, the lock to the object is with the thread 0, but still T1 is started. T1 can start before the lock also, but if you see, this method is called. This is not a synchronized method. Before it has released the lock. T0 has released the lock. So we can execute synchronized method as well as non-synchronized methods simultaneously using the same object. Okay, so that is pretty much possible. Okay, so what we can conclude, that we can execute the synchronized as well as non-synchronized methods simultaneously using the same object.